The people were eating out of the garbage cans, sleeping on the street, any place that they could sleep. They had a blanket they could spread in the bus station, train station. They would spread it in a corner, any place they could see. That's where they would spend the night. With no money.
I'd heard this commotion out in the hallway one time, and it was winter, and this family was being evicted out of the building. They had 2 children, and we used to play with the kids, and they were the same age. And I went downstairs with my cousin, and here was all their furniture out on the sidewalk, right on the edge of the street, not on the street, but right on the curb, where people could still walk by. But there, I remember seeing their dressers and their couch and different pieces of furniture, and the 2 kids were sitting up on top of one of the dressers, and it was snowing. And I said, my mom came down, and I said, "Mom, what's going on?" And she said, "Well, they couldn't pay the rent, you know, they got evicted." We suffered a little bit in the Depression for lack of food. Food was scarce. The 4 adults weren't working. My mom found a job working in a hot dog stand, and she was able to bring some of the buns home, and once in a while some of the hot dogs. But my uncle did menial labor now and then, and he was able to bring home some food. I can remember my uncle getting some of the older potatoes from the guy downstairs that we got to know, and bringing them up and making a potato pancake for us. And we were lucky to get an onion in it ground up, but he would make a good potato pancake. And us cousins would sit on a towel on the center of the living room floor. We didn't have much furniture, and that's what we had to eat for the whole day.
We're all probably familiar with these stories and images from the Great Depression. But it's an often forgotten fact that many of these heartrending accounts have a common denominator: location.
The city, where they had food lines, and people would have to, I don't know how often they went or what they got, but it kept them alive, and we didn't have that problem. We always had things on the shelf, and even now when I shop, I got more on the shelf than I probably, eat.
We were a very poor Depression family, but we lived on a farm, and we had food, and they canned. And I can remember them getting up in the middle of the night to put wood in the fire, always on a wood stove. They're just, as poor as we were a very self-sufficient, happy family.
What would happen to this nation if some event or series of events plunged it into a depression like 1929? What would be different now? Would it hit us harder than it hit them? Are we more vulnerable than they were? Back in the Depression era, a little more than half of America lived in an urban area, a city. Now that number has skyrocketed to around 80%. And as a sure result, we become much more dependent for our necessities of life. Take food, for instance. During the Depression, 1 out of every 5 people in the workforce were involved in agriculture. Now the number that produce our food is only slightly more than 1%. At first blush, this appears to be a good thing. But the only way this has happened is through major dependence on heavy equipment, fuel, chemicals, and other products which may or may not be available to the farmer in hard times. Without these modern devices and products, would our food system be able to produce enough food for the more than 300 million people in this country? And even if the farmers can produce enough food, are we assured that it will make its way to our grocery shelves and that we will be able to buy it?
And you need to know that in our large cities, there's about 3 days' supply of food. Now, those supermarket shelves may look really full, and they are, because when you're taking it off, the clerks are stocking the shelves. And if they didn't stock the shelves just at the rate that you take it off without a panic, all those shelves would be empty in about 3 days, because the trucks need to keep running to keep those shelves full. What if the trucks didn't run? There are a number of things that could bring about situations where there could be really serious civil unrest in the cities.
Manufacturers, they make to order. And so when the order comes in, that's when they manufacture. A lot of manufacturers just don't warehouse anymore. Again, that's money. So having product tied up in a warehouse is money sitting there. And they aren't to tie up their money like that. The stockholders don't like to see that. But that supply, if you had a disaster anywhere in one of these major manufacturing areas, it would stop the trucks, it would stop trucks coming in with the supplies, it would stop trucks from going out to supply your major chains. And the major chains have their warehouses, and again, that product is turning over and over daily. And so it's not like they have half their warehouse full of flour. Flour has a certain slot within that warehouse. And to keep flour in that slot, they have to have trucks coming in all the time to replenish that. So you stop those trucks, you stop the supply of products to the stores. You know, one of the things I think of is in the event of a disaster, what do people do? They flock to the stores. They buy up all their staples and water. So your store will be empty faster than it's ever been empty before.
Unfortunately, though, food is not the only problem.
Beyond the well-known issues of air pollution and water pollution, I think today an even larger concern relate to the political and the social arena. I think we have all, as Americans, have been aware since 9/11 that the cities are going to be the targets for terrorists. The terrorism involves not only destructive weapons, but bioterrorism. A rural area is not a fruitful area for terrorism. The terrorists are going to be looking for the biggest bang for their buck they can get, the highest yield of death. And that's exactly why they mention such things as malls and stadiums, and where there are going to be large concentrations of people. But there are other major biological threats outside of terrorism. The most recent example, of course, was the bird flu. And while I was at the Hanford site, we were making preparation for what we would do if there were massive outbreaks of the bird flu. And at that point, we were even planning on how we would handle the large number of people who could possibly become infected. The fact that the hospitals would immediately be overwhelmed. What buildings and sites could we use to quarantine perhaps hundreds of people? And what we would do as a medical team to deal with this public health national emergency and crisis.
The more people there are around, the faster this epidemic will spread. If you're not in the cities, you're just by distance and space, you have some meaningful measure of protection.
As disconcerting as bioterrorism and the pandemic threat is, one factor has contributed more to the utterly dependent state of this nation than any other: electricity.
If you just think today about the world we live in and all of the creature comforts we have, you will recognize that essentially none of them would be there without electricity. It is the power source for almost everything out there. You can't communicate. If the electrons don't flow in your car, the gasoline won't explode in the cylinders and you won't go down the road. So if you cut off the flow of electrons in our world today, it's just a whole different world. And the grid upon which we depend for almost everything is very vulnerable. It is just at the tipping point, is the way that the experts will characterize it. Our demand has grown, and the grid has grown just barely enough to keep up with demand. And it is really almost a Rube Goldberg kind of thing. And the least little perturbation can bring parts of the grid tumbling down, as happened in Florida not very long ago. The great Northeast blackout of several years ago. A tree limb fell on a wire out in Ohio and caused a great blackout half a dozen years or so ago. Any little thing can bring down large parts of the grid. It is very vulnerable to terrorists. I am told that there are a dozen substations in the country that are so critical to the function of the grid that if terrorists took out those dozen substations, the grid would come down. And could have events in the future where the power grid will go down and it's not in any reasonable time coming back on.
We all know, but still pay insufficient attention to the frightening scenario of a comprehensive cyber attack, which would bring to a complete halt to the power supply, transportation, hospital services, our society as a whole. The COVID-19 crisis would be seen in this respect as a small disturbance in comparison to a major cyber attack. To use the COVID-19 crisis as a timely opportunity to reflect on the lessons the cybersecurity community can draw and improve our preparedness for a potential cyber pandemic.
For instance, if when the power grid went down, some of our large transformers were destroyed, damaged beyond use. We don't make any of those in this country. They're made overseas, and you order one, and 18 months to 2 years later, they will deliver it. Our power grid is very vulnerable. It is very much on the edge. Our military knows that. And sometimes it's very difficult to do what they call a black start. That is, to start without electricity. Many of the things that produce electricity need electricity to start them spinning. If you don't have electricity, how do you do that? They call it a black start. And many of our big power-producing turbines and so forth cannot do a black start. They've got to have electricity from somewhere else to charge them and get them spinning so that they can then start making electricity. If you go do a Google search and go on the web, this isn't some strange knowledge that the Congress has and nobody else has. It's out there. This is pretty widely known that our grid is very vulnerable. And if you just think about all the things that are important in your life, how many of them wouldn't be there if the grid has gone down? You can get some measure as to what the world is going to be like, what your country is going to be like, what your community is going to be like if we don't have power. So there are a number of events that could create a situation in the cities where civil unrest would be a very high probability. And I think that those who can and those who understand need to take advantage of the opportunity when these winds of strife are not blowing, to move their families out. I'll tell you something else about this. It's just plain fun. When you're looking at the challenge of what do I have to do so that I'm independent of the system.
But I think that you have to have, you would have to have some like farming skills. You should be out on your own little piece of land or with several friends or something, and raise your own food, have your own fruit trees, and have your, your water system, and how you're going to get along if all these utilities are cut off,
The banking situation, when this thing all falls through, we're going to have to be ingenious in making things work and dependent upon God. Because when this thing falls through, there won't be anything to rely on. I read a book one time that said that when this thing happens to this country, all financial support will be taken away from us. There'll be no financial support. We have to learn how to live without money. And the guy in the country is the one who's going to do this. People in the city are going to be cutting each other's throats. Well, there are cutthroats now, but your garden in the city is not going to be yours. It's going to be everybody's. So we'll be like kings and queens living out in the country where we can have a garden to supply our family's needs.
It says here, warning, this book is the property of the United States government. It is unlawful to sell it to any other person or to use it or permit anyone else to use it, except to obtain ration goods in accordance with regulations of the Office of Price Administration. Cooperate with your local salvage committee. I don't believe this is over. I believe that in the future, because what I saw happen in Katrina, in New Orleans with Katrina, I think that was a wake-up call to people that live in the cities. Those that have their eyes open and are listening and maybe reading their Bible will understand what is going to happen in these cities. Things are going to happen that are going to be a lot worse than what happened in New Orleans. I believe we'll go back to rationing of some kind. And at that time, I would want to be living in the country with fruit trees and a garden and have my, my food and water sure.
So I think that provident people who understand, who have a responsibility to their families, will be looking more and more to getting out of the cities. And it's a huge challenge. There's no exhilaration like the exhilaration of meeting and overcoming a big challenge. You stop and think about, gee, what do I need to do so that I can be independent out there? That if the world fell apart, it really wouldn't matter for me and my family. That's really an interesting challenge. By the way, one other reason for doing this is it's a really patriotic thing to do. Because for all of our citizens who aren't dependent on the state when an emergency happens, we're going to be stronger and stronger, aren't we? So as a member of Congress, I'm concerned. I would like everybody to do this. I would like everybody to have a year's supply of food. I'd like everybody to have some plan so that they can make do if any one of these emergencies occurs. But it's going to be easier to do that. And you'll avoid the problems of civil unrest if you're out of the cities and out in the country.
We need to get out.